what I want to see is obviously Britain, the British government, be leading. We hear loads of rhetoric around coalition of the willing. And, quite frankly, I think this government is quite tiresome on foreign affairs when it does statements and platitudes and all the rest of it. You've got to have action. Trump's an action-type president. He'll want to see action from us.
The shadow Foreign Secretary, Dame Priti Patel, has been unrelenting in her demands to give Ukraine more help, both political help and indeed military help. She joins me now in the studio. Thanks so much for coming in, Priti. Are we doing enough at the moment, and how do you react to what's apparently not happened at the summit?
Let's start with the latter point in terms of what happened or what went on in Alaska. So I think, look, they've obviously met. Jared is absolutely right. This was much more about Putin getting out of the international chiller and back onto the red carpet and the international stage. However, I think we're going to have to look at this now as a process. This is going to be piece by piece, step by step. And President Zelensky going to the White House on Monday is equally as important as the meeting that took place yesterday. The reality right now, which comes back to your point number one about where Europe sits and Britain's role, etc., is that Britain has been vocal. I personally feel we should have been stronger and more vocal. I was part of a government that clearly was there at the outset, convened Europe and, Jeff countries and all the countries on the eastern flank, because our security and their security is at stake here right now. Russia is a very significant military power in Europe. That threatens us. It also threatens America. We have to be doing much more right now. The one thing I would say,
what should we be doing?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think we should do much more on the military side. My party and I have been consistent on that. So yes, in terms of the equipment, the drones, the support, but there is a sort of elephant in the room here, which is on sanctions. I think we could be much more aggressive around secondary sanctions. We've been calling for that. We also feel that we've got to be smarter and work much more collaboratively actually with the Europeans in releasing a lot of the money that's been tied up from Russian sanctions to actually fund Zelensky and Ukraine's machine against Russia.
Which was a demand made on this programme by a Ukrainian opposition politician only an hour ago.
And they've been consistent in that. We met with them for many, many months, in fact, recent years as well, to do more on that front. But there is something else, and I think Europe has had some influence, and Britain in that quarter as well, in terms of making it quite clear to President Trump that Ukraine has to be at the table around any future discussions around Ukraine. There can be no territorial secession whatsoever. And clearly we need a lasting and a just peace. This could be the process towards that. But what I want to see is obviously Britain, the British government, be leading. We hear loads of rhetoric around coalition of the willing. And, quite frankly, I think this government is quite tiresome on foreign affairs when it does statements and platitudes and all the rest of it. You've got to have action. Trump's an action-type president. He'll want to see action from us. The other point to make about what we've seen in Alaska, I personally think that's a bit of another calling card to Europe, which is step up, because we've heard the Americans consistently say they don't want to be funding this. They don't want to keep on being at the table. Europe is closer to Ukraine. Why don't you guys, so to speak, to use an Americanism, be much more forward-leaning? I actually think this weekend or yesterday's session was actually a big message to Europe to say, come on, be there. Don't just be at the table, but put your troops in if you want, or put your weaponry in there. Do much more. And I think Britain has to be there.
I was going to come to that, because you say that sanctions are the elephant in the room. Well, there's another elephant in the room. We have a room full of elephants, troops on the ground. So Donald Trump did, in fact, say, if there are going to be any troops on the ground, you better look to Europe for that. Would you be approving of the security guarantees to Ukraine, which put British troops on the ground in Ukraine?
That's what it's about. I think we're going to head into one of those discussions at some stage, right? This is about security guarantees.
Yeah.
Because it's our security that's at stake here, as well as Ukraine's. So I think, number one, look, we're not there yet. We're clearly not there. So it's about all the measures and all the steps that would take place before we even get to that stage and we get to that level. And Britain has to be.
But would you rule it out?
I don't think we can rule anything out right now. We've just seen a discussion that was behind closed doors and only photos that came out of Alaska. We don't know the context and the details. I don't think the British government has much idea right now at this stage as well, which is to my point. That's why Britain has to come back and show leadership. Where are we going with all of this? If President Trump gets to the stage, let's say post his meeting with Zelensky, and of course there's still, will there be a trilateral? We don't know yet. Putin doesn't even recognise Zelensky as, the democratically elected leader in Ukraine. So there's a lot here that we need to unpack. At some stage, could that come? And if so, what would security guarantees look like? Britain has to be a voice at the table when it comes to the future security. What do security guarantees look like? Is it much more in terms of weaponry? Is it more money? Is it going to be training more troops to then go in and be up the eastern flank or in Ukraine? We don't know. But these are the areas that the British government really needs to be thinking about, discussing, and quite frankly, I would argue, leading some of our European colleagues in those discussions as well.
Well, except that comparatively, in terms of, it's a comparatively easy decision to make to fund Ukraine better, to send more military equipment to Ukraine. The Rubicon, in a way, is whether actually European troops at all get involved in protecting Ukraine, and what that might mean if the Russians did attack after a ceasefire.
It's also a question, Rod, of what would it look like. So, I personally think, as a country, we've left the EU, for example. Despite, we've successfully left the EU, and yet Britain led. After Russia's illegal invasion, it was Britain that stepped up and convened European countries and others. I believe we still have a role to play in doing that, and that could mean shaping things going forward. I don't think it's as binary as you suggest around just funding and giving equipment, because if it was so straightforward, surely we would have been doing much more of that by now. And even that has been subject to negotiations and discussions over what kind of equipment goes in and who does it. I think fundamentally the real challenge right now is, number one, speaking with one voice and actually Britain showing strong leadership and convening around all of this. And number two, even on sanctions, being coordinated. We're not coordinated. Europe isn't coordinated. Other allies are not coordinated. The whole narrative around secondary sanctions is not coordinated. This is a big moment to put more pressure on Putin, and I would argue that's what Britain should be doing.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that both Sir Keir Starmer and David Lammy, who I've never been a huge fan of, have actually handled this stuff quite well?
Well, we could argue that, but I think at the end of the day, it's all about results. We're still on the treadmill of going round and round. And one could argue, you've heard Ukrainian politicians on your programme. I've been meeting with them for months and months. They've been calling for much more, certainly over the last 12 months, and that hasn't come together. We've had various convening meetings. Convening is the easy thing to do, if I may say so, Rod, in terms of foreign ministers and all the rest of it. You can talk to each other as much as you want, but the substance has to be the action that then comes forward. And that's what we're still waiting for. I would argue we've successfully done that. We should be back there leading a lot of that. We've got a lot of skin in the game. We're heavily invested in Ukraine. I would argue Europe is as well. America is. America's put a lot of money in this. That's why President Trump is convening and doing what he did in Alaska, because it costs them money. He cares. We want to see an end to the killing, but how are we going to achieve it? And I think this is a new pathway that Trump has now set. We can't just keep on going back to the old narratives. Britain can step in and have a good leadership role here.
A couple of other questions on different issues. You will have read about the State Department's assessment that Britain is its human rights have regressed over the last year as a consequence of presumably Sir Keir Starmer's government, and that freedom of speech is under threat. Got a point, have they?
I think there is a big point here. There's no question about that. We hear the terms, two-tier justice and all of this, right down to policing. This is effectively now becoming a live reality, policing people's thoughts, speech, etc. That's hurting us. That really is. It's hurting our international reputation. There's a report out there in the US State Department. That's not good for us internationally. And what I would say, you mentioned David Lammy and, how they've handled, how he's looked at Ukraine. But actually this hurts us because it's about Britain's place in the world. It's about global Britain, our reputation. And do not forget, we've always been a country that's been open when it comes to free speech, fighting for values of freedom of belief and all those key things. and also standing up to autocracy in the world as well. So I think, we should be back out there. I'm very vocal about this in my current role and capacity. There is so much more that we can do, should do, and we shouldn't just be hiding behind, dare I say it, the lefty lawyers, the Human Rights Brigade, which I'm afraid has defined this government thus far.
And finally, and just briefly, your party is languishing in the polls. I think I forget what it was the last time I looked, about 18%, 18%. Are you not tempted to join Reform?
No.
Why not?
We lost the election last year. It's going to take a long time. I call it the hard 9 yards, basically, in terms of, climbing Mount Everest. Some days there's more oxygen than other days. We have to re-establish our credentials and credibility with the British public, who felt very let down and disillusioned by us. And to do that, we have to be the genuine advocates of conservative values and beliefs. This isn't about joining other political parties that are not conservative.
They're doing very well.
They might be, but they're not they're not conservative in their instincts, their values, their beliefs, and where they're going. We are. And we believe in fighting for those values in the same way, Rod. That's why we're so vocal about Ukraine, standing up to autocracy, not kowtowing to those countries around the world that are our adversaries, which is exactly what Labour's doing with China right now. We have to fight for our values and the beliefs in the same way in which we did in a very successful way in the 1980s. I think, when you look at the geopolitical situation right now, it's no different to the period before the Cold War ended, 45 to 89, the end of the Berlin Wall. We all thought was a great triumph. I'm old enough to remember all of that, but I do remember what it was like prior to that time all over again. It was conservative values and beliefs, actually with the United States as well, that fought for those freedoms and the battle of ideas, and that's where my party is, and that's where we're going again.
Dame Priti Patel, thanks ever so much for coming in.
Thank you, Rod.
Lovely to talk to you.
Nice to speak to you.
Cheers.